Today it's my turn to officially, in a way, on behalf of ERI, welcome you, each one of you, and those who will be joining, all right, to our second Zoom training of this year. And this is, the theme of today is ERI's engagement with the human rights system.
So, welcome everyone. And before I start on the United Nations mechanisms, just a little bit brief explanation of the Human Rights Council, which is situated here in Geneva. Tino will be speaking at greater length on this later in this training program. So the Human Rights Council is a forum empowered to prevent abuses, inequity, and discrimination, protect the most vulnerable, and expose perpetrators. And it consists of 47 elected United Nations member states. They serve for an initial period of 3 years each and cannot be elected for more than 2 consecutive.
I'm sorry, Terry, you just need to unmute yourself, sorry. Can you unmute yourself, Terry?
Did you mute me? Sorry.
Yes, I did. I'm sorry. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So
All right.
just if you can just go back and start again, that might.
Okay, we'll do that.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry about that.
Sorry, everyone. It's just Tino causing trouble, you know, but we'll forgive him. So the Human Rights Council consists of 47 elected United Nations member states. They each serve 3 years and they can be elected or can carry on for a second term. Now, there are 193 missions here in Geneva. 47 of them form the Human Rights Council. And that is they are elected in certain amounts of states in various blocks. For example, the Africa bloc might have 13 states. The Latin American bloc so much, the US bloc so much, the European bloc, Asia, Pacific, etc., etc. And they make up the 47 members of the Human Rights Council. From those 47 members, a president is elected every year from a particular bloc, and they take it in rotation, and then there are 4 vice presidents elected. And the Human Rights Council meets in Geneva in March, June, and September of each year. Oh, come on, no, I won't. Okay. So where do we fit in as an NGO? Only NGOs with consultative status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, can participate in Human Rights Council sessions as observers. So Edmund Rice International has got ECOSOC status with the United Nations in New York, and so we can participate in Human Rights Council sessions as observers, etc. But Tina will explain a bit more of that. And they can address the council during interactive discussions and debates, thus highlighting human rights violations around the globe. And we'll show you all that during this session. So what I want to do with you are, what are the mechanisms of the United Nations for particular human rights? The first is the Universal Periodic Review. And it's a mechanism of the Human Rights Council that seeks to improve the human rights situation on the ground of each of the 193 UN member states. So that's one we'll be discussing. The second thing we'll be discussing is the treaty body system. And this is totally independent of the Human Rights Council. They are appointed, the treaty body committees are appointed by the General Assembly of the United Nations, but we'll explain what this is about also. And then third thing is the special procedures. They are independent human rights experts tasked by the UN to investigate and report on human rights situations around the world. I'll explain a bit more of that as we go on. So the first portion is the Universal Periodic Review process, the UPR process. And what's important to understand is this is a peer review system because states review states. Now, what is that about? So it was created in 2007 and implemented for the first time in 2008. This is just a bit of history. And the 47 members of the Human Rights Council form what they call the review all the other member states. And the aim of the process is to ensure that all 193 member states of the UN are reviewed equally and transparently by other member states in a cooperative dialogue. It's not a vindicative approach process, it's a cooperative dialogue. It's very important to understand that, what the UPR process is about. Now, it's a unique process. In other words, reviews the human rights records of all 193 UN member states, and it gives all the states an opportunity to demonstrate actions taken to improve their human rights situation. And it gives the UN a chance to address human rights violations and to help, now this is very important, and to help states deal with human rights challenges. And also remind states of their responsibility to fully respect all human rights and fundamental freedoms. Now, please, that's very highfalutin, as it were, and it's an incredible aim to get all that done. Please remember that states are political entities also, and that comes into all this process, as we'll explain. So the UPR and its goals, all 193 states are reviewed on an absolutely equal basis. This process takes place over 4.5 years. I'll explain that a little bit more later. And the performance in human rights obligations, all human rights are given equal attention in this process. So what are the objectives then? First, the improvement of the human rights situation on the ground in a particular state, the fulfillment of the state's human rights obligations and commitments, assessment of positive developments and challenges, help the state, enhance the state's capacity give technical assistance if needed, share good practices, and encourage full cooperation and engagement with the Human Rights Council and other human rights bodies and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the OHCHR. So these are the objectives, which are very laudable. And of course, remember, states are human institutions and political institutions. And not all of this happens ideally, as it were. So who conducts the review? So the reviews are conducted by the 47 elected member states of the Human Rights Council. And during the UPR process, they are known as the working group, those 47 elected members. The other member states participate in the discussions just as observer states. So a question we might think about during this session now is, why is the review known as a peer review system? I actually really answered that question for you, but just think about that. Okay, now we're going to show you a little video on the UPR process.
The Universal Periodic Review, or UPR, is one of the most accessible human rights mechanisms of the United Nations Human Rights Council. It's a useful tool for human rights defenders, and the reason is right there in the name. It is universal, covering all 193 states and all human rights. civil, political, economic, social and cultural. It is periodic, meaning that the process is regular and predictable, with each state reviewed approximately every 5 years. And it is a peer review process, where other states can make recommendations to your country on its human rights progress. The scope and breadth of the UPR means that you, as a human rights defender, can use it to raise awareness of the human rights situation in your country and to hold states accountable. Although the UPR process is led by states, you can take part at every stage in a variety of ways. Before the review is based on information submitted in national, UN and civil society reports. By contributing to these reports, you can influence the content and course of the review itself. For example, you might participate in a national consultation or lobby your government directly to make sure they include your concerns in the official state report. You can also prepare your own civil society report highlighting the most pressing human rights issues in your country. And you don't have to do this alone. Working with partners and other civil society actors can help amplify your voice and impact. You could also use a UPR pre-session to meet with delegates from other states and encourage them to raise certain issues. This is particularly effective because the states conducting the review do not necessarily know the human rights situation on the ground. During the review itself happens in Geneva and takes the form of an interactive dialogue. This is where reports are considered and states make their recommendations. The state under review can then either accept the recommendations or note them. While only representatives of member states are permitted to speak during the interactive dialogue, you can still follow the session and raise awareness of proceedings through the media. When the UPR outcome report is later presented for adoption by the Human Rights Council, you have the option to make an oral statement. This can be a good opportunity to highlight issues raised during the UPR. After the review. It might seem that once a review in Geneva is finished, then it's all over for the next 5 years. But that's not the case. Your country is expected to implement the recommendations it has received before the next review. By publicizing the recommendations and engaging in advocacy, you can help keep the focus on their implementation. You can also monitor progress by producing a UPR midterm report. Each and every country in the world has a responsibility to protect human rights. Through the Universal Periodic Review, human rights defenders can ensure states abide by human rights standards, live up to their commitments, and promote and protect the rights of all.
So there was a lot of information in that little video. So what we're going to do now is look at this process again as a way of revising what was said in that video. So one cycle takes about 4.5 years. There are 3 sessions a year, and in each session, 14 states are reviewed, and each state is given 3.5 hours through interactive dialogue. So if you do the arithmetic, if there are 3 sessions a year of 14 states, each year 42 states are reviewed, and to get through 193 states would take about 4.5 years. So we are into the 4th cycle now. So every state has been reviewed 3 times, and the 4th cycle started in November 2022. So gives you an idea of all the work that goes on. 42 states a year. In each session, 14 states, 3.5 hours. It takes time, etc. So let's look at the process then, or the 4 phases of the UPR. Before the review takes place, there is the preparation of 3 reports that was mentioned in the video. The state itself produces a 20-page report on what it has done since its last review. That is submitted and published about 6 months before the review actually takes place. Other UN bodies like embassies and UNICEF, and United Nations, all other UN bodies can also submit reports on the particular state. All those things are summarized into a 10-page report. And similarly, civil society organizations can submit their own report, and they are also summarized into a 10-page report. And this is where we come in as Edmund Rice International. In the countries, like you saw last week in the training, in all the countries around our world, we are interested in their periodic review. So, for example, Canada was reviewed in November last year. We submitted a report on Canada 6 months before that, and that was summarized in the civil society report of 10 pages. Now, these are published 6 months beforehand, and you can go in and see if what you submitted, the issues you brought up or recommendations you brought up, are summarized in that 10-page report. And sometimes it might be a joint submission by you and some other civil societies. And then it will be, say you are number 13, that would JS joint submission 13 said this. Later in the 10-page, it might say joint JS 13 said that, etc. So you can check whether your issues have come up. So that's the first preparation, and that's all published about 6 months before the review takes place. In between that and the review, there is an interactive session done by UPR Info, where various civil society organizations are brought together here in Geneva, and various missions here attend those. And during that session, we often go in and lobby with various missions that are present. We bring a 1-page summary of what we submitted and say, for example, Belgium, we are a civil society organization, Edmund Rice International. We are interested in these issues. This is a 1-page summary. This is our recommendation. Will you be interested in bringing these things forward when you make your recommendations during the review process? And they always say, yes, we'll take this on board. We'll see about it and see if we can do that. So that's an interactive thing between the reports and the actual review. Now, when the review takes place, it's a 3.5-hour session. We can monitor and listen to this and see what's happening. So we can do this by watching the video or the YouTube or the video session, or we can go in person and monitor this. The state speaks to this, and then various states speak and make their recommendations. They bring up issues and they make recommendations. So that takes place for 3.5 hours. We are just monitoring this and listening and seeing if any of our recommendations have been brought forward by a particular state. Now, it's quite a lengthy process and quite a time-bound process, because depending on how many states want to make recommendations, the time given to the states is divided up. And sometimes they might have only 90 seconds, they might have 1 minute, they might have only 50 seconds to say what they want to say and make their recommendations. So after the 3.5-hour review session has taken place, this is number 2, the Secretariat at the Human Rights Council goes away and it summarizes all the recommendations of all the states. And a couple of days later, it brings the summary back, and there could be over 300 recommendations, and they divide it up into thematic sections, etc., on various human rights issues. And then that summary or that review of what document on the review is submitted to the council, and then they vote to accept that. So that's what happens. Then we go to the third thing. That summary and document that's been adopted is sent to the state under review. And they take that away and they study all those recommendations. And they come back at the next Human Rights Council session, not the next UPR session. And this might be 3 months later. And they present their report on what recommendations they have accepted or supported, that's the word they use, or some recommendations they may have just noted. Now that document, their acceptance and noted things are published before that adoptions outcome session of the UPR. It's called an outcome session. So for example, Canada was reviewed in November last year. The outcome session for Canada was just in March this year during the Human Rights Council. Now it's during that outcome session, we can look at all these recommendations that they've supported and noted, and we can make a submission then, a verbal or an oral statement via video or in person, where we speak to what issues we think are very, very important, what recommendations have been supported, and where we think they can do better. So that's where we get a chance to do that. So then that's the closing session. That takes for about an hour or so during that Human Rights Council session. This is the outcome session. And then that's finished then. Now we get to the fourth stage. It's the next 4.5 years where NGOs like ourselves and advocacy coordinators around the world, schools, etc., can look at these reports on the Human Rights Council websites, etc., and see all these documents and can interact with states officials and bring up issues, bring up the recommendations that they supported and are not doing, etc. And that fulfills the whole 4 phases of the UPR process. So that gives you an idea where the reports in between, where we can speak to states, the review process, the outcomes report where we can make a statement, and then the follow-up during the next 4.5 years. And very often in the follow-up process, the states are supposed to submit a midterm report. Very often they don't do that. So again, just to summarize again, here are the preparation of a review, where we submit our stakeholder information report, the pre-session where we can meet with states and lobby. This is the interactive dialogue. There can be side events held at the UN buildings on the particular country. The adoption session, which is the outcome session, that's where we can make a statement, and then monitoring the progress during the 4.5 years. So that's the whole cycle about this. So what we're going to show you now is where we make an oral statement in the outcomes, and this is Brother Tino speaking to the outcomes on the UPR of India. Now, India's review took place in November 1922, and the outcome statement where the recommendations were accepted, etc., and noted, and we are speaking to that in March of 2023. So let's listen to that.
And now for a joint statement, I give the floor to the representative of Edmund Rice International.
Mr. Vice President, Edmund Rice International, Vides and Pratyek commends the constructive participation of India in its 4th UPR. Concerning children at risk of separation and in need of alternative care, we welcome the acceptance of Recommendation 151.305 and highlight the importance of reintegrating children and families whenever possible. We welcome the acceptance of Recommendations 151.256, 279, and 285. However, we are concerned about the increase of child marriages and teen pregnancy during the pandemic and recommend that India reconstitute village and neighborhood level child protection committees to monitor and address child labor, child marriage, child trafficking, and sexual abuse. We regret that recommendations 151.203 and 204 were only noted, as the pandemic has worsened critical educational issues, as shown by low enrollment, high dropout rates, and shortage of qualified teachers, especially in rural areas. We urge India to make mental health education and counselors mandatory in all schools and embed the education of the SDGs into the school curriculum. We urgently call on India to effectively implement the Right to Free and Compulsory Education Act, ensuring consistency of states' legal frameworks. We welcome the acceptance of recommendation 151.35 and urge India to delay no further and appear for its treaty body review before the Committee on the Rights of the Child. We welcome the acceptance of recommendations 151.37 and 38 and urge India to fix dates for the visit of the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Obligations and the Environment. We call on the state to declare climate emergency and reverse the weakening of laws, practices, and institutions that protect the environment. Finally, we urge India to engage children in reviewing the national policy for children and include their environmental rights in the same. Thank you.
Thank you.
So there's the chamber in which Tino spoke. And you can see he referred to various recommendations, some of which they supported and others they only noted. In other words, it's meaning they're not going to do anything about it. And he raised various issues there. And he had to do that in 90 seconds. So that gives you an idea of the whole UPR process.